Hello and welcome to Imperium Code channel. So today's session we will be discussing why you should not be client obsessed. And the thing is, it is well known in the market that, well, generally speaking, and in any business, the more client you have, the more profit, income, money you end up generating, which means success. And I would like today for all of us to pause for a second and really assess that statement and figure out whether or not it's entirely true. So let's start with a couple of scenarios. Actually, we will go through the scenarios that we have been through based on our past experiences in Imperium Code or even before starting Imperium Code. Also, we will go through scenarios that happen in the market in general, etc. And then at the end of the session, we will really conclude whether or not it's always good to have more clients. So let's start with the first case. Imagine you going to a meeting, starting a certain discussion about a project. You start by getting to know the client, you start by getting to know who they are, for example, what are their interests. Sometimes the conversation might cover different topics generally, and then you would start explaining about your services and why you are the perfect service provider that this client should work with. And let's say hopefully it all works out and you get the project. You start the project together and you start working on the project. But then down the line, eventually, when it comes to reaching the payments, deadline, the due payments, you find that the client's process when it comes to accounting is a bit troublesome. It's too bureaucratic. It requires a lot of physical signatures, dependent on a lot of people to be in the office and around to actually provide those signatures in time, so that you don't really miss getting paid on your deadline, and then you eventually do. So your company start running or functioning on low liquidity, and especially for big projects that require a lot of operational costs. So you end up either having to sacrifice quality or time, which eventually ends up bad for both parties. Now, even if the accounting process by itself was not really an issue, and even if the clients were paying on time, that by itself is not enough to be able to work with a certain client. So let's take another scenario or case. Imagine working with this person and then after a while figuring out that, yeah, this client has a really bad reputation. They don't really pay, they don't like to pay the last payment, the last due payment of the project. They would just try to find their way out of it, or they like to find some little loopholes in the contract so that they can gain more features or end up having more support from your side, and then you start uh, feeling that, yeah, you're dealing with the wrong people here. You thought that this client was at a certain mindset with a certain standard, and then you were shocked to find that no, this client has a really bad reputation, very bad ethics, unprofessional, and trying to just win the best out of this deal. So it's really important to also be careful about that and about the client's reputation in general. So let's continue to other scenarios. Assume now you are starting to work on a project. You know he is or he or she, the client is reputable, they pay on time, there are no accounting issues, there's still the biggest and the most troublesome issue in the whole market, which is defining the need. And I'm not saying it's the most important, but it's the point where most of the service providers, even the clients, fail at doing. You need to really understand what your client needs, and not only what the client needs, but what actually the business needs. And there's a big difference here. Sometimes the client think they know what they need, but what the business needs is entirely totally different thing, with a totally different approach. So it's up to you as a service provider to identify that and to clarify that and to be able to pinpoint the difference and advise. And assuming you were not really able to do so, and the need was either miscommunicated or poorly written or poorly defined in terms of requirement, you end up at the end of the project trying to deliver the project and saying, yes, I completed the project, it now works. But then the client would end up saying, no, this is not actually what I need. This is not actually what I asked for. I asked for something else. I want push notifications here and there. Things that the client ended up assuming that, yeah, they are given, they exist in any app, so why should I even mention them? And then, yeah, you find that the damage has already been done and there's literally nothing you can do. Either you need to add those features at cost or even pay from your own pockets, or you need to say no to the client, which would end up hurting this client and damaging them, even though it might not be your fault. But yeah, guess what? As a service provider, most of the times it ends up to be your fault. And even if you don't really believe so, and if the contract is on your side, well, you will eventually end up losing your reputation, because the client will not be happy. They will end up talking bad about you, and it will not be a satisfying experience for both ends, nor productive nor scalable. So that's why it's really important to look at the big details, of course, the big things, the big milestones, and what's more important, at those little details that really make all the difference. That's why what's even let's say very important and very related to defining the need is not only defining the requirement, is also to define how to test those requirements and how to validate those requirements to be entirely true. Because the testing process by itself might take ages if each and every one of you is testing differently. So that's another practice we will be talking more and more about in our future sessions. It has its own procedures, practices that we can advise you, that we use in Imperium code, and that really make a big difference. Now, other than the defining the need and making sure the client has enough let's say no issues when it comes to accounting, and they have a good reputation, you also need to know that the client is actually a serious client or not. Most of the clients that come your way, they have a name. They're called kind of just random shoppers, which means when someone goes shopping, most of the times they don't end up buying anything. You see most of the people in the mall looking at the clothes, admiring the clothes, most of the times even asking about the price of the clothes, adding criticism, but then they don't end up buying anything. And then some of them, they would even waste the time of the customer support just because they can, just because they want to just have fun. It's a pleasure for them. And then they would go to the second store, and then they end up buying nothing from that mall in general, and maybe buying another piece from another place, or maybe searching the same piece online and finding it in a cheaper price and getting it in a better deal. I'm not saying that That's wrong. It's entirely their right to do so. But however, in this case, as a service provider, you are the victim here, because the client would come, they would tell you, okay, I want to build the software, I want to have 1, 2, 3 in the software. You would start writing the requirement, you would start preparing the proposal, you would start locking your resources, your developers to work on this project. And then after a week, 2, maybe even a month, sometimes more, the client would just show up and say, okay, thanks a lot, I now know the quotation, I'll let you know when I'm ready to start, I'm going to go and start getting funded. And then they may end up not getting funded, they may end up really returning and doing the project, which is good, and they also may end up just disappearing and doing the same project with someone else or hiring their own team. You cannot guarantee, but what you can know is that the damage has been done. So this is another issue that is out there that you have to really be careful about. So let's jump to another scenario. Let's assume you started working on the project, the requirement is well defined, the testing is well defined, the payments are okay, the client is serious, they have paid the down payment, they have a good reputation, etc. And then you start asking the client for feedback. And then you stop and you just wait for the feedback to come, and you wait a day or 2 days, you send the client a notification, a reminder to give you the feedback on the certain components, because sometimes, and most of the times, the phases are dependent on each other. You cannot move to another phase or to another component before getting feedback on the component, on the initial component that you're working with, because you're building a structure and you're building the whole building. You cannot come back to the first floor later when you have already built the second floor. So you need that feedback. So eventually, even if the client ended up giving you a feedback after 2 weeks, well, you got the feedback, but you have a 2-week delay. And if you got delayed, and even if you blame the client, the damage has been done. One, you have lost time. You have lost time of the resources that you could have spent on another project. 2, the client may have had expected to release on a certain date and have hired a certain marketing team or other teams that are dependent on this project so that they can really start advertising it, etc. And the client would lose that budget if they did not, if you did not really release on time. And no matter whose fault that might be, and even if the client understood, the damage also have been done on all sides. Not to mention the other damage that might be caused when the project is very time critical. For example, it needs to be delivered before the World Cup, because the World Cup is a one-time event every X years. So, or for example, if it's being released to a hospital that will need it severely to a series of surgeries that will happen at a certain time in the month. So you really need to be careful here. You really need to make sure that you can actually communicate with your client, reach your client, that the client is actually responsive and not busy to answer your feedback calls. And that's really the tip of the iceberg here, because another scenario that might happen within the same umbrella is getting feedback from multiple people. So for example, you might get a certain feedback from the CTO of the client, and then another feedback from the CEO, another one from the COO, another one from the designer that's working with the client, another one with a consultant, or like their testing audience that they're conducting the surveys on, or like helping them with QA. Which feedback do you end up taking? Which feedback would you consider to be the final one, and how do you build for the next step? And in case you got different feedbacks that are not really in sync, you would end up trying to resolve that and finding which way to go. And if you go one way and then another person suggests another, and then you have to kind of destroy all of that you have already built, and then restart again. So when you think about it this way, and after realizing that there are so much details and so many details, you start thinking twice before just accepting or like just being happy to work with any client that comes your way. And that's when it comes to the operational part. Other issues that might happen also, they are probably something related to the legalities. For example, not agreeing on the terms of the NDA or the non-compete. Some clients might come and tell you, if you build my reservation system, then you're not allowed to work in this industry or build another reservation system from now until 5 years later. And really, you're a service provider. You might have 10 clients who are building the same reservation system or a competitive reservation system, and even if you don't tell them anything, they would still have the business know-how. They would still ask most of the same common functionality. So signing that non-compete would actually mean that you are losing potential future business. So what would you do in that case? Would you sign the non-compete and lose the business? Would you not sign? Would you ask for a royalty fee in return? There's a lot of details and a lot of approaches that you can go down the line, and most of them end up causing your time to be wasted, also the client's time, and just ending up with not agreeing on anything, and then moving on to another client, and the client would be moving on to another service provider, etc. So it's really important to understand the legality, and not only when it comes to NDAs or non-compete, but also to the proposal terms, to the contract, to the actual dynamics of the work. When do you mark the project as complete? What happens if you finish the project and the client doesn't provide feedback for a period exceeding 30 days after the project has been done? Is it marked as complete automatically? Is there a damage fee to be paid? What happens if the client decided to stop working on the project in the middle of the work? Is there any damages? Do you simply refund them their money, etc.? So that's when it comes to legalities. There's these small details, but also they make all the difference. Who owns the code? Do you own the code? Does the client own the code? If you deliver the code to the client at the end of the day, should you keep it on your servers? Who agrees to what? And what about the maintenance plan? Do you actually keep maintaining the code even after going live for like a year for free? Or is it a service that the client has to pay a retainer for it per month? Or do they just pay upon request? So all of this stuff really needs to be decided from the beginning. And the problem is sometimes you or the client fail to really notice them, and they end up just trying to solve them as they come. And imagine doing that at scale. It really cannot be done. And one of the scenarios, actually, you can end up working with a client where you aligned on all of these stuff, but then when you expect feedback, you get the feedback, but you don't understand anything of the feedback. You understand the client means ABC, you understand CDE, because the client has poor technical knowledge, so he or she was using random words or random technical words to sound as if they are knowledgeable, but they end up misleading you and guiding you to think that you have to solve something else, or not being able to. They would be saying, yeah, the login page is not working, and they might mean with that the Google sign up is not working, or the Facebook login is not working, or maybe they mean that, yeah, it's only not working on mobile, and you cannot really decipher that or guess. You have to test each and every scenario when they just throw that out there. If you don't know the context and if the client is not explicit enough, you would end up having to guess and having to fix random things, or having to say yes it's working and then they would say no it's not, and then you would end up arguing, and then only after going into a live meeting and wasting more time that you would understand what they actually meant in the first place. Now, the client, when they start working, or when they actually request something from your end, sometimes they come with certain limitations, constraints. For example, they would say, okay, I need a delivery app to be built with $5,000 by within the next 30 days, and this is a fixed deadline, and I don't have the designs, but I need this to be done, and go ahead, take the project, I trust you, do whatever you want. Would you take the project or not? Would you operate and be able to build the project? So the main question would be, in those circumstances, if they're like literally impossible or virtually complex circumstances, would you accept taking the risk and trying to complete that project within the given time constraints and budgetary constraint? Or would you say no? It's literally like operating on a patient. Imagine going to a doctor's office and telling them, yeah, please operate on me. I need to do a heart surgery because 2 weeks from now I have to end up going on a trip, or visiting my family in another country, and I want to take the plane, so I need to be ready for it. So take wherever you need and just operate on me. Would the doctor say yes? Or would the doctor actually tell you that, yeah, there's a procedure for it, you need to do some exams to make sure that the operation can actually succeed, etc. So eventually you are the service provider, which means that you are accountable of the quality of the work that will end up being generated. And if you cannot guarantee that, then it's your responsibility to accept or reject the risk. And what's more important is that you need to make sure that the client actually trusts what you're doing and understands the value of what you're doing, because if not, then the client would end up just calling you every second of every day, asking you about the project progress, questioning every decision you're making, whether you're using the right technology or not. Why did you use React.js instead of Flutter? Every time they hear something in the market or a new technology that happens, or that boomed, or that someone else is using, they're gonna come and they're gonna ask, okay, why didn't you really choose this technology instead of that? So what would you end up doing? Explaining each and everything? Would you really spend all of the time and the hassle trying to explain each and every decision you're making? Imagine even asking, some clients actually did that. Some clients, before starting a project, they might tell you, hey, send me the CVs. I like everything. I've heard a lot of good things about you, and I want to work with you. But before working with you, please send me the CVs of all of the employees you have in the company who will be working on the project, and I'll need direct access to them so that if anything happens, I can call them anytime I want, and I can ask them any questions I need, and I want to make sure that they are qualified to do the work. Would you actually send those CVs? Would you give them access to your employees or not? And these are real scenarios that you have to be aware of. Other clients might tell you, hey, listen, yeah, it's perfect, we're gonna start working together, but even though you're freelancing and outsourcing, since we're in the same area, come to our offices once every week, or twice or 3 times even, and work at our office so that we can have more visibility. And other scenarios might happen where the clients might actually ask you, hey, listen, can you give us access to the code while you're working, because we want to audit your code quality and we want to make sure that you are doing the right thing. And we want to ask our friends about what they think about your quality while you're working. So, yeah, there's a lot of cases like these, believe it or not, and I'm sure most of you have already been through there. And let me ask you this: what would you do if a client comes your way and would tell you, hey, I know you're working on this feature, I know we agreed to do this feature, but how about changing it to that? And then you say no because this is what we signed on, this is what was explicit on both sides, assuming it was, and you reject that change request. And then the client might tell you, okay, you don't want to change it yourself? Fine. Give me the code, I'll get another company, they will change it for me, and you continue working on the rest of the project. So now you have more people to deal with, you have to reintegrate the code after they finish working, and you have to work closely with them to make sure that they respect your coding convention. And all of these scenarios are cases of things that really happened with us, with other people, with us before starting in Premium Code, or even after. And we understood one thing, that, yeah, the client or having more clients is not necessarily the main or the most positive thing that can happen to a business and to be able to scale. And we understood even more scenarios. We understood scenarios, we experienced scenarios where we found that even the client, after signing all of the agreements and making sure that all is fine, we figured that, yeah, this client is not even eligible to work in our area or region or country, or even send payments to our bank account, because in their country it's prohibited to deal with our country for other political reasons. So that's another barrier that's not really entirely related to the client, him or herself, the entity itself, but it's more related to the reality we're living in. So it seems that there's a lot of details, and there is. And it's not a piece of cake to really figure them out from the start. And that's why we decided to really step in and start with this topic, in order to share our experiences, share our practices, share our process that allowed us to scale, to handle those issues, and to avoid them. And every time I wanted to close this subject, I just remember another case and another scenario that might happen. And there's a lot more, really much more than you can think of, uh, down from the small details of even taxation. Sometimes you might disagree on taxation process. You would tell your client, hey, listen, it's $1,000 to pay for the project, that's the project cost, and then they would send you $992 or $987 or even $930, depending on the tax rate in their country. And then you would be shocked, and then you would understand that, yeah, the client actually thought that the $1,000 is actually after tax, not before tax. That's why it needs to be clear as well there. Sometimes the client wants to pay cash, and you're not allowed to accept cash because you need to have financial transparency to your bank, to your auditor, to your country, to show how the money is flowing in your company. Or sometimes you only accept cryptocurrency, and the client doesn't want to deal with cryptocurrency, or vice versa. So before jumping into doing business with any client, and before um, allowing ourselves of saying, yeah, more clients means more business, means more success, we have to really pause and think about all of the things that I've mentioned today. And this is only part one of this video. In the next video, we will be discussing more about this. We will be discussing the practices that we have done in order to avoid all of the hassle that that might be caused and all of the problems and all of these scenarios from even happening, and hopefully even more details that we'll end up talking about even in our future videos. So stay tuned. Do not forget to subscribe if you haven't, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you soon.